Section 6 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Matilda of Flanders, Chapter 3, Part 2. Matilda's will, which is in the Imperial Library of Paris, in the register of the Abbey of the Holy Trinity at Caen, fully bears out the assertion of her epitaph, touching her poverty, since, from the items in this curious and interesting record, it is plain that the first of our Anglo-Norman queens had little to leave in the way of personal property, and, as the bulk of her landed possessions, they were already settled on her son Henry. "I give," says the royal testatrix, "to the Abbey of the Holy Trinity my tunic worked at Winchester by Alderet's wife, and the mantle embroidered with gold, which is in my chamber, to make a cope. Of my 2 golden girdles, I give that which is ornamented with emblems, for the purpose of suspending the lamp before the great altar. I give my large candelabra, made at St. Lo, my crown, my scepter, my cups in their cases, another cup made in England, with all my horse trappings, and all my vessels. And lastly, I give the lands of Quetchou and Cotentin, except those which I may have already disposed of in my lifetime, with 2 dwellings in England, and I have made all these bequests with the consent of my husband." It is amusing to trace the feminine feeling with regard to dress and bijouterie, which has led the dying queen to enumerate, in her last will and testament, her embroidered tunic, girdle, and mantle, with sundry other personal decorations, before she mentions the lands of Quetchou and Cotentin, and her 2 dwellings in England, which are evidently objects of far less importance, in her opinion, than her rich array. Du Carrel tells us, that among the records preserved in the archives of the Holy Trinity at Caen, there is a curious manuscript containing an account of Matilda, the royal foundress's wardrobe, jewels, and toilette, but he was unable to obtain a sight of this precious document, because of the jealous care with which it was guarded by those holy ladies, the abbess and nuns of that convent. Till the middle of the 17th century, the portraits of Matilda and William were carefully preserved on the walls of St. Stephen's Chapel at Caen. The queen had caused these portraits to be painted when this magnificent endowment was founded. We have seen, by the Bayeux tapestry, that Matilda took great delight in pictorial memorials, and if we may judge by the engraving from this portrait, preserved in Mount Faucon, it is a pity that so much grace and beauty should fade from the earth without remembrance. Her costume is singularly dignified and becoming. The robe simply gathered round the throat, a flowing veil falling from the back of the head on the shoulders, is confined by an elegant circlet of gems. The face is beautiful and delicate, the hair falls in waving tresses round her throat. With one hand she confines her drapery, and holds a book. She extends her scepter with the other, in an attitude full of grace and dignity. Montfaucon declares that this painting was actually copied from the wall, before the room in which it was preserved was pulled down. The elegance of the design and costume ought not to raise doubts of its authenticity, for it is well known that all remains of art were much better executed before the destruction of Constantinople than after that period. Female costume, with the exception of some tasteless attire which crept into the uproarious court of William Rufus, was elegant and dignified. The noble circlet, the flowing transparent veil, the natural curls parted on each side of the brow, the vestal stole drawn just round the neck, in regular folds, the falling sleeves, the gently belted waist with its gemmed zone, confining the plaits of a garment that swept the ground in rich fullness, altogether formed a costume which would not have disgraced a Grecian statue. We shall see this elegant dress superseded in time by the monstrous Syrian caps, of sugar-loaf or horn form, and by the heraldic tabards and surcoats, seemingly made of patchwork, which deformed female costumes in succeeding ages. But we must not look for these barbarisms at the date of Matilda's portrait. Matilda bore 10 children to her royal spouse, namely, 4 sons and 6 daughters. Robert, surnamed Courthose, her eldest son, succeeded his father as Duke of Normandy. This darling son of Matilda's heart is thus described in the old chronicler's line: He was ewoks, grown, ere his father to England came. Thick man he was enow, but not well long. Square he was, and well made for to be strong. His fadder, once on a time, he did sturdy deed, when he was young, who beheld him, and these words said: By the uprising of God, Roblin me sall see, the Courthose, my young son, a stalwart knight sall be. For he was somewhat short, so he named him Courthose, and he might never after this name lose. He was quiet of counsel and speech and of body strong, never yet man of might in Christendom ne in Paynim, in battail from his steed could bring him down. After the death of Matilda, Robert broke out into open revolt against his royal father once more, and the Conqueror, in his famous deathbed speech and confession, alluded to this conduct with great bitterness, when he spake of the disposition of his dominions. These were the words of the dying monarch: The dukedom of Normandy, before I fought in the vale of St. Gulac, with Harold, I granted unto my son Robert, for that he was my first begotten, and having received the homage of his baronage, that honour given cannot be revoked. Yet I know that it will be a miserable reign which is subject to the rule of his government, for he is a foolish, proud knave, and it is to be punished with cruel fortune. After the death of his father, Robert acquired the additional cognomen of the Unready, from the circumstance of always being out of the way when the golden opportunity of improving his fortunes occurred. Robert, though an indifferent politician, was a gallant knight and a skilful general. He joined the crusade under Godfrey of Boulogne, and, to obtain the funds for this purpose, mortgaged the dukedom of Normandy to his selfish brother William, for the sum of 6,666 pounds of silver. He so greatly distinguished himself at the taking of the holy city, that of all the Christian princes, his fellow crusaders, he was judged most deserving of the crown of Jerusalem. This election was made on the Easter eve, as they all stood at the high altar in the temple, each holding an unlighted wax taper in his hand, and beseeching God to direct their choice. When the taper which Duke Robert held, being ignited without any visible agency, it was regarded by the rest of the Croises as a miraculous intimation in his favour, and he was entreated to accept the kingdom. Robert, however, at that critical juncture, hearing of the death of William Rufus, refused the proffered diadem, and returned to Europe under the idea that he should obtain the crown of England. But not only did he fail of dispossessing his brother Henry of England, but he was finally defeated by him at the battle of Tinchebray, stripped of his dukedom, and made prisoner. After a weary captivity of 28 years, Robert died at Cardiff Castle. While in the Holy Land, he had married the beautiful and amiable Sibylla, daughter of the Count of Conservana, by whom he had one son, named William. Richard, the second son of William the Conqueror and Matilda, died in England in the lifetime of his parents, as we have already stated. William, their third son, surnamed Rufus or Ruse, from the colour of his hair, and called by the Saxon historians the Red King, succeeded to the crown of England after his father's death. He was slain in the New Forest, by the erring shaft of his favourite hunting companion, Sir Walter Tyrrell, whom he familiarly called Wat de Poix, from the name of Tyrrell's estate in Picardy. Henry, the fourth and youngest son of William and Matilda, won the surname of Beauclerc by his scholastic attainments, and succeeded to the throne of England after the death of William Rufus. The personal history of this prince will be found in the memoirs of his two queens, Matilda of Scotland and Adelicia of Louvaine. There is a great confusion among historians and genealogists respecting the names of the daughters of Matilda and the Conqueror, and the order of their birth, no two writers appearing to agree on that point, except with regard to the eldest princess, Cecilia, who was veiled a nun in the Abbey of Fescamp, and became the abbess of the nunnery of the Holy Trinity, founded by her mother Matilda. William of Malmesbury, who wrote in the reign of Henry I., when enumerating the daughters of the Conqueror, says, Cecilia, the abbess of Caen, still survives. The generality of historians mention Constance, the wife of Alan, Duke of Bretagne, as the second daughter of this illustrious pair. Ordericus Vitalis, a contemporary, calls her the third, and Agatha the second daughter. Of Agatha he relates the following interesting particulars. This princess, who had been formerly affianced to Harold, was demanded of her father in marriage by Alfonso, king of Galatia, but manifested the great repugnance of this alliance. She told her father that her heart was devoted to her first spouse, as she called Harold, and that she should consider it an abomination if she gave her hand to another. She had seen and loved her Saxon betrothed, and she revolted from a union with the foreign monarch whom she had never seen. And bursting into tears, she added, with passionate emotion, that she prayed that the Most High would rather take her to himself than allow her ever to be transported into Spain. Her prayer was granted, and the reluctant bride died on her journey to her unknown lord. Her remains were conveyed to her native land, and interred at Bayeux, in the church of St. Mary the Perpetual Virgin. Sandford calls this princess the sixth daughter. If so, she could not have been the betrothed of Harold, but of Earl Edwin. And indeed, if we reflect on the great disparity in age between Harold and the younger daughters of William of Normandy, and take into consideration the circumstances of his breach of contract with the little Norman lady, and that he died the husband of another woman, it is scarcely probable that his memory could have been cherished with such a degree of passionate fondness as Ordericus Vitalis attributes to the Lady Agatha. Whereas Edwin was young, and remarkable for his beauty, he had, in all probability, been privileged with some intimacy with the princess, whom the Conqueror had promised to bestow on him in marriage. The breach of this promise on the part of William too was the cause of Edwin's revolt, which implies that the youthful Thane was deeply wounded at the refusal of the Norman monarch to fulfill his engagement, and it is at least probable that to the princess, who had innocently been made a snare to him by her guileful sire, he might have become an object of the tenderest and most lasting affection. Malmesbury, speaking of this princess, says, Agatha, to whom God granted a virgin death, was so devoted to the exercises of religion, that after her decease it was discovered that her knees had become hard like horn with constant kneeling. W. Gemintensis and other ancient chroniclers assert that it was Adelicia, the fifth daughter of William and Matilda, that Harold was contracted, and that she died young. Perhaps this is the same princess whom Ordericus Vitalis mentions as their fourth daughter, of whom he says, Adelaide, very fair and very noble, recommended herself entirely to a life of devotion, and made a holy end, under the direction of Roger de Beaumont. Adela, or Adelicia, generally classed as the fourth daughter of William and Matilda, Ordericus Vitalis places as the fifth, and says, she was sought in marriage by Stephen, Earl of Blois, who was desirous of allying himself with the aspiring family of the Conqueror, and by the advice of William's counsellors, she was united to him. The marriage took place at Breteuil, and the marriage fetes were celebrated at Chartres. This princess was a learned woman, and possessed of considerable diplomatic talents. She had 4 sons: William, an idiot; Thibaut, surnamed the Great Earl of Champagne; Stephen de Blois, who succeeded to the English throne after the death of Henry I, and Henry, Bishop of Winchester. After the death of the Count de Blois, her husband, the Countess Adela took the veil at Marigny. Gundred, the sixth and youngest daughter of the Conqueror and Matilda, was married to William de Warenne, a powerful Norman noble, and the first Earl of Surrey in England. By him the Lady Gundred had 2 sons, William, the successor of his father and the progenitor of a mighty line of earls of that family, and Reynald, who died without issue. The Countess Gundred died in childbed at Castle Acre in Norfolk, and is buried in the chapter house of St. Pancras Church, within the priory, at Lewes in Sussex. The death of his beloved queen Matilda afflicted the Conqueror very deeply. He wept excessively, for many days after her decease, and to testify how keenly he felt her loss, he renounced his favorite amusement of hunting, and all the boisterous sports in which he formerly delighted. After this event, his temper became melancholy and irritable, to which, indeed, a train of public calamities and domestic vexations might in a great measure contribute. To the honour of Matilda, it has been asserted by some of the historians of the period, that she used her influence over the mind of her mighty lord, for the mitigation of the sufferings of the people whom he had subjugated to his yoke. Thomas Rudbourne, the author of the Annals of Winton, says, King William, by the advice of Matilda, treated the English kindly as long as she lived, but after the death of Matilda, he became a thorough tyrant. It is certainly true, that after Matilda left England in 1070, the condition of the people became infinitely worse, and it is possible that it might be aggravated by her death. Not only the happiness, but the worldly prosperity of William, appeared sensibly diminished during his widowed state. In the course of 4 years that he survived his consort, he experienced nothing but trouble and disquiet. William met with the accident which caused his death, at the storming of the city of Mantes. He had roused himself from a sickbed, to execute a terrible vengeance on the French border, for the ribald joke which his old antagonist, the King of France, had passed on his malady, and in pursuance of his declaration, that he would set all France in a blaze at his uprising, he had ordered the city to be fired. While he was with savage fury, encouraging his soldiers to pursue the work of destruction to which he had incited them, his horse, chancing to set his foot on a piece of burning timber, started, and occasioned his lord so severe an injury from the pummel of his saddle, as to bring on a violent access of fever. Being unable to remount his horse, after an accident which must have appeared to him like a retributive chastisement for the barbarous deed in which he was engaged, he was conveyed in a litter to Rouen, where, perceiving he drew near his end, he began to experience some compunctious visitings of conscience, for the crimes and oppressions of which he had been guilty. In the first place, he ordered large sums to be distributed to the poor, and likewise for the building of churches, especially those which he had recently burnt at Mantes. Next he set all the Saxon prisoners at liberty, whom he had detained in his Norman prisons. Among them were Morcar, and Olnoth, the brother of Harold, who had remained in captivity from his childhood, when he was given in hostage by Earl Godwin to Edward the Confessor. The heart of the dying monarch, being deeply touched with remorse, he confessed that he had done Morcar much wrong, and bitterly bewailed the blood he had shed in England, and the desolation and woe he had caused in Hampshire, for the sake of planting the New Forest, protesting, that having so misused that fair and beautiful land, he dared not appoint a successor to it, but left the disposal of that matter in the hands of God. He had, however, taken some pains, by writing a letter to Lanfranc, expressive of his earnest wish that William Rufus should succeed him in his regal dignity, and to secure the crown of England to this his favourite son, for whom he called as soon as he had concluded his edifying acknowledgment of the errors of his past life. And sealing the letter with his own seal, he put it into the hands of the prince, bidding him hasten to England with all speed, and deliver it to the archbishop. He then blessed him with a farewell kiss, and dismissed him. When the Conqueror had settled his temporal affairs, he caused himself to be removed to Hermintrude, a pleasant village near Rouen, that he might be more at liberty to prepare himself for death. On the 9th of September the awful change which awaited him took place. Hearing the sound of the great bell in the metropolitan church of St. Gervas, near Rouen, William, raising his exhausted frame from the supporting pillows, asked, what it meant? One of his attendants replying, that it then rang prime to Our Lady, the dying monarch, lifting his eyes to heaven, and spreading abroad his hands, exclaimed, I commend myself to that blessed Lady, Mary, the Mother of God, that she, by her holy intercession, may reconcile me to her most dear Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. And with these words he expired, in the 64th year of his age, 1087, after a reign of 52 years in Normandy and 21 in England. His eldest son Robert was absent in Germany at the time of his death. William was on his voyage to England. Henry, who had taken charge of his obsequies, suddenly departed on some self-interested business, and all the great officers of the court having dispersed themselves, some to offer their homage to Robert, and others to William, the inferior servants of the household, with some of their rapacious confederates, took the opportunity of plundering the house where their sovereign had just breathed his last, of all the money, plate, wearing apparel, hangings, and precious furniture. They even stripped the person of the royal dead, and left his body naked upon the floor. Everyone appeared struck with consternation and dismay, and neither the proper officers of state, nor the sons of the deceased king, issuing the necessary orders respecting the funeral, the remains of the conqueror were left wholly neglected, till Herluin, a poor country knight, but in all probability the same Herluin who married his mother Arlata, undertook to convey the royal corpse to Caen at his own cost, for interment in the abbey of St. Stephen, where it was met by Prince Henry and a procession of monks. Scarcely, however, had the burial rites commenced, when there was a terrible alarm of fire in that quarter of the town, and as there was great danger of the devouring element communicating to the cloisters of St. Stephen, the monks, who were far more concerned for the preservation of their stately abbey than for the lifeless remains of the munificent founder, scampered out of the church, without the slightest regard to decency, or the remonstrance of Prince Henry and the faithful Herluin. The example of the ecclesiastics was followed by the secular attendants, so that the hearse of the mighty William was in a manner wholly deserted, till the conflagration was suppressed. The monks then re-entered the holy fane, and proceeded with the solemnity, if so it might be called. But the interruptions and accidents with which it had been marked were not yet ended, for when the funeral sermon was finished, the stone coffin, set in the grave which had been dug in the chancel between the choir and the altar, and the body ready to be laid therein, Anselm Fitz-Arthur, a Norman gentleman, stood forth and bade the interment. "This spot," he says, "was the site of my father's house, which this dead duke took violently from him, and here, upon part of mine inheritance, founded this church. This ground I therefore challenge, and I charge ye all, as ye shall answer it at the great and dreadful day of judgment, that ye lay not the bones of the despoiler on the hearth of my fathers." The effect of this bold appeal of a solitary individual was an instant pause in the burial rite of the deceased sovereign. The claims of Anselm Fitz-Arthur were examined, and his rights recognized by Prince Henry, who prevailed upon him, as the lawful owner of the soil, to accept 60 shillings as the price of the grave, and to suffer the interment of his royal father to proceed, on the condition of his pledging himself to pay the full value of the rest of the land. The compensation was stipulated between Anselm Fitz-Arthur and Prince Henry, standing on either side of the grave, on the verge of which the unburied remains of the conqueror rested, while the agreement was ratified, in the presence of the mourners and assistant priests and monks, whereby Henry promised to pay, and Fitz-Arthur to receive, 100 pounds of silver, as the purchase of the ground on which William had, 35 years previously, wrongfully founded the abbey of St. Stephen's, to purchase a dispensation from the Pope for his marriage with his cousin Matilda of Flanders. The bargain having been struck, and the payment of the 60 shillings earnest money, for the occupation of the 7 feet of earth required, as the last abode of the conqueror of England, being tendered by the prince and received by Fitz-Arthur, strange interlude as it was in a royal funeral, the obsequies were suffered to proceed. According to some historians, an accident occurred in placing the lid on the stone coffin, attended with such unpleasant results, that mourners, monks, and assistant priests, after vainly censing the chancel with additional clouds of incense, fled the church a second time before the interment was completed. This tale, inasmuch as it was refuted by the appearance of the royal remains when the grave was opened upwards of 450 years afterwards, we are disposed to regard as a piece of mingled marvellousness and malice on the part of the Saxon chroniclers, who have taken evident pleasure in enlarging on all the mischances and humiliations which befell the unconscious clay of their great national adversary in its passage to the tomb. Yet surely so singular a chapter of accidents was never yet recorded, as occurring to the corpse of a mighty sovereign who died in the plenitude of his power. William of Normandy was remarkable for his personal strength and for the majestic beauty of his countenance. It has been said of him that no one but himself could bend his bow, and that he could, when riding at full speed, discharge either arblast or longbow with unerring aim. His forehead was high and bald, his aspect stern and commanding, yet he could, when it pleased him to do so, assume such winning sweetness in his looks and manner as could scarcely be resisted, but when in anger no man could meet the terror of his eye. Like Saul, he was, from the shoulders upwards, taller than the rest of his subjects, but before he became too corpulent, his figure was finely proportioned. His eloquence was both powerful and persuasive. His habits were temperate, and his household was well regulated, with a view of the strictest economy. Yet upon proper occasions he indulged his taste for magnificence, and took pleasure in appearing in all his royal state. He wore his crown 3 times in the year, at Christmas or midwinter day, in the city of Gloucester, Easter at Winchester, and when he celebrated Whitsuntide at Westminster. He wisely carried his court, it seems, at these festivals, to different parts of England. William Rufus caused a stately monument, adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones, and very rich sculpture, to be erected to the memory of his father, before the high altar of St. Stephen's Abbey. The loftiness of stature which contemporary chroniclers have ascribed to William the Conqueror was fully confirmed by the post-mortem examination of his body, which was made by the Bishop of Bayeux in the year 1642, when, prompted by a strong desire to behold the remains of this great sovereign, he obtained leave to open his tomb. On removing the stone cover, the body, which was corpulent, and exceeding in stature the tallest man then known, appeared as entire as when it was first buried. Within the tomb lay a plate of copper gilt, on which was engraved an inscription in Latin verse. The bishop, who was greatly surprised at finding the body in such perfect preservation, caused a painting to be executed of the royal remains, in the state in which they then appeared, by the best artist in Caen, and caused it to be hung up on the abbey wall, opposite to the monument. The tomb was then carefully closed, but in 1562, when the Calvinists under Castellan took Caen, a party of the rapacious soldiers forced it open, in hope of meeting with a treasure, but finding nothing more than the bones of the Conqueror wrapped in red taffeta, they threw them about the church in great derision. Viscount Falaise having obtained from the rioters one of the thigh bones, it was by him deposited in the royal grave. Monsieur Le Bras, who saw this bone, testified that it was longer by the breadth of his 4 fingers than that of the tallest man he had ever seen. The picture of the remains, which had been painted by the order of the Bishop of Bayeux, fell into the hands of Peter Ildo, the jailer of Caen, who was one of the spoilers, and he converted one part into a table and the other into a cupboard door, which proves that this portrait was not painted on canvas, but as usual on wood. Some years after, these curious relics were discovered and reclaimed by Monsieur Bras, in whose possession they remained till his death. No sooner had the Calvinist spoilers plundered the abbey of St. Stephen and exhumed the bones of the Conqueror, than they entered the Church of the Holy Trinity, threatening the same violence to the remains of Matilda. The entreaties and tears of the abbess and her nuns at first had no effect on the rapacious bigots, who considered the destruction of church ornaments and monumental sculpture an acceptable service to God, quite sufficient to atone for the sacrilegious violence of defacing a temple consecrated to his worship, and rifling the sepulchres of the dead. In this instance, they contented themselves with throwing down the monument, breaking to pieces the effigies of the queen, which lay thereon, and opening the grave in which the royal corpse was deposited. At that juncture, one of the party, observing that there was a gold ring, set with a fine sapphire on one of the queen's fingers, took it off, and, with more gallantry than might have been expected from such a person, presented it to the abbess, Madame Anna de Montmorency, who afterwards gave it to her father, the Baron de Conti, Constable of France, when he attended Charles IX to Caen in the year 1563. In 1642, the monks of St. Stephen collected the bones of their royal patron, William of Normandy, and built a plain altar-shaped tomb over them, on the spot where the original monument stood in the chancel. The nuns of the Holy Trinity, with equal zeal, caused the broken fragments of Matilda's statue and monument to be restored, and placed over her grave, near the middle of the choir, on a tomb of black and white marble, 3 feet high and 6 long, in the shape of a coffin, surrounded by iron spikes and hung with ancient tapestry. The restored monument of Matilda remained undisturbed till nearly the close of the last century, when the French Republicans paid one of their destructive visits on the Church of the Holy Trinity at Caen, and, among other outrages against taste and feeling, swept away this memorial of its royal foundress. But while a single arch of that magnificent and time-honored fane, the Church of the Holy Trinity, survives, the first of our Anglo-Norman queens, Matilda of Flanders, will require no other monument. End of section 6.